Nazanin, thanks so much for talking to us. There's a lot going on in the world at the moment with Israel and Gaza. It has become a focal point, and I think as we look at that conflict, there's so much complexity in it, but as we look at it, we really need to understand Iran's role in it and its proxies. What do you say about that, first up?
Well, thanks for having me. You know, I think the reaction of the Iranian or the Islamic Republic authorities when right after Hamas attacked in such a brutal, horrific way innocent Israeli civilians, that was very telling. That reaction of jubilant celebration that the authorities in Iran spread videos of and shared videos of says everything. They, by this action, by Hamas's brutalities, have managed to divert attention away from women life freedom and the domestic abuse that they're unleashing on their own people. And they've jeopardized the Saudi-Israel normalization process. So yes, they are the #1 backer of Hamas and Hezbollah. They fund them, they train them, and I think this was intentional.
Yeah, and what we do see is, I think, a fig leaf. Again, Iran sending its proxies to do its work for now. I don't know what a point that escalates. But Israel's stated aim now is to defeat Hamas. But you can't defeat an ideology. How do you approach that difficult question?
I mean, one thing we have to be very mindful of is Israel playing into the hands of Hamas? Is this exactly what Hamas wanted? For innocent Palestinian civilians to die and then be able to radicalize even more people and children and be able to use more human shields and be able to unleash more terror as a result? We have to at some point end this vicious cycle of violence, and I think it takes extreme moral courage to be able to do that. And at some point we have to understand that justice and revenge are two separate things. Hamas needs to be ended. There's absolutely no way that region will be free and peaceful with Hamas and Hezbollah's existence. But what's the cause of it here? What's the cause of that terror? And from my perspective and the type of work I do, I point fingers to the Islamic Republic authorities as the backer of Hamas and Hezbollah. They are responsible for that terrorism as their proxies. And again, as I said, it's intentional. It works in their favor to have this instability. It diverts attention away from their own abuses. And as long as the Islamic Republic regime is in power, the Middle East will not be peaceful and there won't be global stability.
I think it's hard to understand what their end game is. Do you understand what the end game is?
You know, there are 3 pillars of the Islamic Republic since 1979, since the inception of the regime. The oppression of women, and the compulsory hijab being the outward symbol of that. Death to Israel, death to America. That was how they were founded. And, you know, that's why the women's rights movement and the woman life freedom revolution is such a powerful force. Because imagine if it prevails in crumbling that one pillar of oppressing and segregating Iranian women. And then another one of them is, of course, the destruction of Israel. And they do that through their proxies, and they try to gain support for it internationally. There's no doubt in my mind that they're trying to influence and interfere with some of these protests to wreak havoc in the West. But we have to be very mindful of not letting that happen. Democracies have a responsibility to band together against autocracies. And so far, unfortunately, for 44 years, the only way we've approached the problems vis-a-vis Iran have been to deal with the symptoms of the problem. So the nuclear issue, terrorism, hostage-taking, domestic oppression, regional aggression. We haven't addressed the cause. The cause is the regime itself, and the people of Iran are demanding fundamental political change. We must support them.
Yeah, and they are doing it bravely and to great personal risk to themselves and their families, because we know from history how these regimes operate. I'm conscious of, as we sit here today, and I wonder if this has crossed your mind as well, where is the line between, you know, imposing our own Western values on a nation, a group of people that might not want to see that? Is there a patriarchal sense of that we're trying to impose, and a kind of belittling that you can't see the best of what you can have? I wonder how you approach that.
That's an excellent question. For 15 years that I've been doing this work, well-meaning progressives have often said to me, well, we can't touch the compulsory hijab issue because that's a cultural issue and cultural differences in the Islamic Republic. For a year now, the brave Iranian women and girls and people have risen up to debunk this myth of cultural differences, because essentially no cultural norm needs to be enforced through threat of violence. What they've proven is that this despotic culture is not theirs. It belongs to their Islamist regime. So now when I talk to a lot of progressive lawmakers, they understand that that was a mistake, that sort of hands-off approach. And what it is, essentially, is this overcompensation in response to imperialism, right? This anti-imperialist approach. But today's liberal Iranian is not the anti-imperialist of yesteryear, of 79. Yeah. This generation is so connected to us and democracy. And to say that they are different and they don't want democracy is actually an insult. Yeah.
And social media obviously has played a huge part in that. The regime, for all its control, cannot shut that window to the outside world, if I can put it that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And the advent of smartphones with cameras and social media has really just increased the way that citizen journalists in Iran can share images of what they experience, the daily indignities they experience. And so that's why internet shutdowns happen, crackdowns happen. And one of the things I said to the foreign minister when I met with her, with Foreign Minister Penny Wong yesterday, was the person, the communications minister in Iran, the Islamic Republic's communication minister, is someone who got their PhD from the University of New South Wales. His 2 kids were born in Australia. He then went back to Iran in 2016, became the communications minister, and is responsible for the internet shutdowns in Iran, and we haven't sanctioned him yet. And that crackdown on the internet allowed the regime to kill in the dark. The EU and the US have sanctioned him, Australia hasn't. So I pleaded with the foreign minister to please sanction him, and people like him who are responsible for abuses.
And was Penny Wong receptive to your plea?
Absolutely, she was very receptive. I look forward to that being implemented. But those are the types of actions we need to take, I think, in free societies to hold them to account.
Well, you're in Sydney to receive the Sydney Peace Prize, and congratulations for that. It is a right and correct acknowledgement of your work. I think sometimes Australians can have a small view of themselves and look at what's happening in the Middle East, what's happening in Iran, and think that's a faraway place. It's not something I'm directly involved in or should get involved with. But what do you think, in a more connected world with globalisation, is the role of a country like Australia?
That's an excellent question. For the past year, I've really been advocating for unity. The way the Islamic Republic has stayed in power, and a lot of autocracies and dictatorships stay in power, is by dividing and ruling. And that doesn't only include their own people. They're not just dividing and ruling their own people, because they understand that the people united will never be defeated. But it's also dividing the international community. And so as long as we are divided, freedom-loving, democratic countries are divided in how we approach Iran and how we approach the Islamic Republic, I should say, and the autocracies are united in their common objectives, this world has no chance. There will be no stability and global peace. Right now, we see the Islamic Republic sending drones to Russia to use against Ukraine. In exchange, they get surveillance technology from Russia to use against protesters and women protesting against compulsory hijab. And same with China, feeds the Islamic Republic with surveillance technology. So they're very much united in their common objectives, and we're just not. We need multinational approach towards the Islamic Republic in order to be able to tip the balance of power in favour of the brave protesters and hopefully see secular democracy prevail.
I mean, it's such a convoluted web which would be, too difficult to explain right now. But essentially it comes down to countries like Iran, the Islamic Republic, its backers, and that web that we talk about. They're winning the information war in many ways. And you see Western democracies like Australia and their citizens, they're pitted against each other.
Absolutely.
Within.
Yes. And that threat of dividing people here, parties, it's not only essential that we have a multinational approach, but a bipartisan cross-party approach towards autocrats and despots and tyranny. And until that happens, we have no way of succeeding. But imagine a free, secular, democratic Iran if the woman, life, freedom revolution prevails. It will not only create, obviously, an incredibly powerful and free democratic country, but it will basically support peace in the region and global stability. I think it benefits every Australian, every person in any free society to fight for the rights of the Iranian people.
Nazanin, can you see that happening in our lifetime? We're similar age.
Yes.
Can you see that happening, for the generation after us?
I can, and the only reason is because I see the tenacity and the resilience of these young Iranians who keep going. Hundreds of thousands of Iranian women are currently still flouting compulsory hijab on the streets of major cities in Iran, despite these brutal crackdowns. And with that type of courage, they can only succeed. What's
really complex as well is that many of our viewers will know that Saudi Arabia is getting very close to a normalised relationship with Israel. Iran and Saudi Arabia are rivals for power in the region. Saudi Arabia does not have a great human rights record. They do not give freedom to their women. But what role do you see them playing? I mean, this isn't a black and white debate. There needs to be some nuance here, doesn't there?
Absolutely. But what's happening again, because we're not united, because democratic countries are not united in a strategy to counter, as you said, propaganda, where China, Russia and the Islamic Republic spend billions of dollars on their cyber armies, on propaganda, we in the West spend in the tens of millions. There's a huge discrepancy there. We don't even know how to counter propaganda properly.
And sanctions don't work.
And sanctions aren't working, and mainly because a lot of them aren't even enforced. We can issue as many sanctions as we want, but if we don't have a strong enforcement regime, they're not going to, for example, right now, the oil revenues in the Islamic Republic are higher than, when the JCPOA was the first year of its implementation, by 15 billion. That's how much it's gone up. And you'd think with all these sanctions that it wouldn't, but here we are. So we need to enforce sanctions, but really the unity really needs to exist. And where there's a void in the Middle East, of course, China's going to come in and be the superpower, the main superpower in the region, brokering these deals. We can't let that happen. I think if we're united as free democratic countries against these dictatorships, against autocracy, then we can. There's no void to fill by an autocracy like China.
In free democratic countries, you have, I think, a loss of confidence and faith in institutions, and I'm talking about banks, big companies, the church. So I want to ask you about the UN. It has a massive role to play in exactly what we are talking about, but has it become a body that speaks to rhetoric, makes great speeches that we can all agree with, but when it comes to action, they are a little bit hamstrung?
Absolutely. Look, the Islamic Republic uses the UN to legitimize itself, normalize itself in the eyes of the public, global public. We had an early victory in Women, Life, Freedom, where they told us it couldn't be done, but we managed to oust the Islamic Republic from the UN Commission on the Status of Women, of course, the UN's highest legislative body on women's rights, which they should have never been a part of. But just 6 months later, the Islamic Republic became vice president of the UN General Assembly, and their representative chaired the social forum at the UN Human Rights Council, and we took 2 steps back. And so the problem with the UN is, yes, everyone has a seat at the table, and that's great, But when UN member states and their representatives don't stand for democracy and they play into the Islamic Republic's propaganda and side with them, then we're never going to see change.
As an activist, I don't even know whether you like that term, by the way, I like it.
Yes.
But as an activist, can you see a pathway to the end game of what you're trying to achieve, or is it about making your life's work those steps and those important small steps forward? Do you just have to take the wins and the small wins where you get them?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, you know, the victories may feel few and far between. This work can be quite demoralising because you're not waking up and finding a nation free and unjust laws overturned. It's a real slog. You have to keep going. But every time you see a hostage freed and the family reunited, every time you see an execution, unjust execution, a sentence stayed, every time you see someone, an innocent person freed from jail, or democracy prevail, that makes everything worth it. So it's a long game, and I don't imagine it's going to be achieved overnight. But I think what we have to keep in mind is, as Bill Clinton said, you know, there's nothing wrong with America that can't be fixed with what's right with America. Essentially, that's true of every democracy. Yeah. The opposite is true with a country like Iran. The very pillars of the system ensure its wrongs can't be made right. That's where we come in. We have to ensure that justice prevails. What can we do to ensure that the Iranian people have all the support they need for self-determination?
Your brilliant brain and your sense of social justice is, I'm sure, what pushes you on every day. But I think that your day job, if I can put it that way, you're an actress, is such a hugely important role that you have as well. Can you just talk to me a little bit how the two work together?
Yeah, I think the common thread really is empathy, meaning, you know, as an actor, I always say I get to portray the human condition and put myself in the shoes of a character and a person where I can play that role. You have to have empathy for a character or a story when you're portraying it on screen. And hopefully as an activist, I get to change the human condition. And again, you have to care and you have to put yourself in another person's shoes to understand their suffering. So I think they sort of go hand in glove.
You need to know how to tell a story.
Yeah, it is hugely dependent on storytelling.
Nazanin, it's a pleasure. I wish we had a couple of hours more, and I hope we speak again. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.